It only took 3 days for Russia to show the world that even the strongest dictatorships have breaking points. Today, we will look at why the sudden mobilization order triggered an eruption unlike anything seen under Vladimir Putin's rule. We'll explore the hidden pressure building beneath years of censorship, economic strain, and political fear, and how one midnight announcement detonated it all. You'll witness how protests spread across major cities and remote regions, how border crossings collapsed under panic, and how government loyalists began questioning the Kremlin's decisions. These events weren't random. They were a dramatic reminder that when a regime pushes too hard, the public eventually pushes back. This is Russia's 72-hour reckoning. For many years, most people outside Russia assumed the country's political system was unshakable, a rigid structure held together by fear, discipline, and the image of an all-powerful leader who had survived every crisis thrown at him. Vladimir Putin's 24 years in power created an environment where open dissent felt impossible. Resistance seemed futile, and the idea of a large-scale national uprising appeared completely unrealistic. Yet in a span of just 72 hours, Russia experienced something few analysts predicted, and even fewer inside the Kremlin believed could happen. A country accustomed to silence suddenly erupted into one of the most dramatic internal crises of the modern Putin era. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe because today's breakdown explores how a quiet government decision sparked a cascade of unrest so powerful that it shook the core of a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of upheaval. What Russia went through was not merely a reaction to a policy. It was a moment that exposed the limits of authoritarian control when the public's patience finally snaps. To understand why those 3 days were so significant, it is important to look at the environment Russia had lived under for more than 2 decades. Since the early 2000s, the Kremlin invested extraordinary resources into building a state where any form of political resistance could be detected, disrupted, and eliminated before it grew. Surveillance expanded into every corner of public life. Major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg became dense webs of facial recognition cameras capable of tracking individuals across entire districts. Internet service providers were required to store user information and share it with intelligence agencies. Social media platforms were monitored with algorithms designed to flag potential organizing efforts. Independent media outlets gradually disappeared, replaced by state-run networks promoting a carefully curated narrative. Journalists who reported uncomfortable truths were harassed, shut down, or driven abroad. Prominent activists faced prison sentences for actions that would be considered minor civil offenses in democratic countries. This system produced a culture where the safest option for ordinary citizens was to remain silent. Protests became rare because the personal risks were too high and the chances of meaningful change seemed too low. The government counted on this silence. It treated it as confirmation that its model of governance was working. But even the most tightly controlled societies contain pressure points. Beneath the managed stability, frustration builds slowly as economic struggles accumulate. Opportunities shrink, and people feel increasingly disconnected from decisions made far above them. The story of those explosive 72 hours shows that once a regime breaks a fundamental promise to its own population, the psychological barrier keeping people obedient can crack in unexpected ways. What happened in Russia was not a spontaneous grassroots movement emerging out of nowhere. It was the result of years of growing tension, finally activated by a government decree that struck at the heart of family life across the country. The spark itself came quietly. There was no dramatic televised address, no emergency meeting broadcast to the nation. It was a simple late-night announcement issued through official government channels, the kind of communication that normally attracts little attention. Yet within minutes, Russian social media erupted. The decree announced a new nationwide mobilization, more expansive and more aggressive than any previous conscription effort. This mobilization was mandatory, indefinite, and, most shockingly, applied to groups the government had repeatedly insisted would never be drafted. Students, retirees, workers in protected industries, even young fathers and individuals with partial medical exemptions, all previously shielded, were suddenly eligible for conscription. This announcement did not exist in a vacuum. Russians remembered the first mobilization in 2022, a chaotic episode that led to the largest wave of emigration the country had seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of men scrambled to find flights out of the country or fled by car to neighboring states. The economic impact was immediate. Skilled workers disappeared from the labor force. Manufacturing plants lost technicians. Hospitals lost staff. Entire IT departments relocated abroad. Businesses struggled to fill gaps. Families were left behind with uncertainty and anxiety. The fear and instability of that period were still fresh in people's memories. Yet the government had spent months reassuring citizens that no such broad mobilization would happen again. Promises came from regional governors, prominent politicians, and even state television hosts. People trusted these assurances because the alternative was too frightening to imagine. Then, with a single document uploaded online in the middle of the night, the government broke its word. That betrayal carried emotional weight far beyond ordinary policy disagreements. It signaled to millions of Russians that the state no longer cared about maintaining even the appearance of predictability. In authoritarian systems, when the government violates a core promise, it risks triggering an emotional chain reaction that can be more destabilizing than any economic crisis. The mobilization decree did exactly that. Within the first hour of the announcement, fear turned to visible outrage. Videos on Russian platforms showed crowded recruitment centers filled with confused and terrified individuals. Parents live-streamed their confrontations with local officials demanding explanations for why their sons were being drafted despite earlier assurances. University students confronted administrators in hallways, shouting that they felt betrayed. Rumors circulated claiming that certain regions were being targeted more heavily, deepening the sense of injustice and regional tension. The confusion was amplified by the fact that many regional authorities appeared just as uninformed as the public. Some issued contradictory statements, insisting the mobilization would not affect students, only to retract their comments hours later. This disorganized response confirmed to many Russians that the government had not planned this properly and did not care about the consequences. As the hours passed, people began gathering in public spaces across Moscow. Major intersections that usually served as silent transportation hubs suddenly filled with crowds. Groups formed around metro stations, creating a ripple effect that pulled more and more people into the streets. Individuals who had never attended a protest before stood alongside experienced activists. Some arrived with hastily made signs. Others came with nothing but their presence and the determination to be seen. In a country where unauthorized protests often end with rapid arrests, showing up was itself a significant act of courage. By the next morning, these gatherings had transformed into a national phenomenon. In St. Petersburg, crowds filled Nevsky Prospect, one of the country's most iconic avenues. In Ekaterinburg, university students marched across campus grounds while faculty members watched from the steps, some visibly torn between their professional obligations and their personal sympathies. In smaller towns and rural areas, families assembled outside administrative buildings demanding answers. The geographic spread was astonishing. This was not limited to major political centers. It extended into regions that had long been considered loyal and quiet. What made this moment even more consequential was the reaction from individuals who normally supported the government. In Russia, political loyalty among commentators, television hosts, and former officials is usually unwavering. Many owe their careers and influence to the Kremlin's favor. Yet within hours of the mobilization decree, some of these voices began speaking out. They criticized the policy as reckless and destabilizing. They expressed concern about its economic impact, its political risks, and its human cost. These criticisms were not coming from dissidents or Western observers. They came from people embedded in the political system. When loyalists break ranks, even slightly, it signals that internal confidence is weakening. Police forces initially attempted to respond with their usual strategy: overwhelming presence, rapid arrests, and intimidation. But they immediately encountered a scale of unrest they had not prepared for. Videos showed officers struggling to control crowds larger than anything seen in years. In Moscow, police lines were pushed back by waves of demonstrators refusing to disperse. In St. Petersburg, units hesitated before advancing. Some younger officers looked uncertain, aware that the people facing them were not hardened activists, but ordinary citizens, parents, students, and workers. In a few documented cases, military personnel assigned to assist police silently stood aside instead of intervening. These were subtle actions, but symbolically powerful. Authoritarian regimes rely heavily on the loyalty and discipline of their security forces. When those forces begin to hesitate, even in small numbers, it becomes a sign that the foundation of control is under strain. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere reportedly shifted quickly from confidence to concern. Regional governors submitted alarming reports. Recruitment centers have been firebombed. Border crossings were overflowing with men trying to flee, and local police units were overwhelmed or exhausted. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers near borders with Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland. Tens of thousands attempted to escape conscription within 48 hours. Economists warned that losing such a large portion of young working-age men would further damage sectors already strained by sanctions. Even before the mobilization, Russia faced shortages of truck drivers, engineers, doctors, and IT specialists. Now, these gaps threatened to widen dramatically. Security officers struggled to process the hundreds of detainees arrested during demonstrations. Some governors privately admitted they were unsure whether their forces could maintain order if protests continued to escalate. This was unprecedented in modern Russian politics. For years, the government had managed dissent effectively by isolating protests, targeting organizers, and deploying overwhelming force. But now multiple fronts were collapsing at once. At an emergency meeting with top advisors, Putin reportedly encountered a rare moment of internal tension. These meetings are usually choreographed displays of unity, but sources described an uncomfortable atmosphere. Officials knew the mobilization had triggered a level of public outrage far beyond what the Kremlin predicted. Acknowledging this mistake risked undermining Putin's authority. Yet pretending everything was under control would leave the government unprepared for further escalation. This internal contradiction reflected a deeper problem. The system built to maintain stability had failed to anticipate how quickly frustration could boil over. Putin responded with a familiar strategy. He intensified repression, expanded arrests, threatened journalists with criminal prosecution for covering protests, and demanded public loyalty declarations from regional leaders. But by then, the protests had evolved beyond the immediate issue of mobilization. They became a broader expression of public exhaustion and disillusionment. Russians were not only angry about being drafted, they were angry about years of economic decline, rising prices, shrinking freedoms, and a government that seemed increasingly disconnected from the realities of everyday life. As the second day unfolded, what made the situation especially dramatic was how quickly the unrest began to shift from scattered demonstrations into a more cohesive national reaction. Russian society is often portrayed as passive, resigned, or indifferent to political decisions, not because people agree with everything the government does, but because many believe resistance is pointless. The idea that the state always wins had been repeatedly reinforced through decades of crackdowns and carefully engineered political messaging. Yet when the mobilization decree shattered the illusion of predictability, people no longer felt controlled by fear in the same way. The sudden rush of outrage created an opening that changed the emotional landscape across the country. Individuals who would never dare to speak openly about politics began sharing their frustrations online. Video clips appeared showing people confronting local officials, challenging police officers, and forming spontaneous crowds around administrative buildings. Each new clip inspired others to act, creating a sense of collective momentum that had been absent in Russia for years. This shift in public behavior carried deeper significance than any single protest could capture. Authoritarian systems rely heavily on the belief that people around you support the regime or at least accept it. When individuals see their neighbors, classmates, or coworkers openly expressing dissent, the fear barrier weakens. A psychological transformation begins to take shape. What started as isolated acts of defiance gradually became a shared movement fueled by a realization that millions of others felt the same anger. This change in public consciousness matters profoundly, because once people understand they are not alone, they become more willing to challenge authority. The second day also revealed cracks inside institutions that typically remain aligned with the Kremlin. Reports surfaced of regional officials privately complaining about the chaos created by the mobilization. Some governors expressed frustration that the decree had been released without adequate planning or guidance. In several regions, recruitment officers found themselves unable to process the sudden flood of paperwork, leading to long lines, confusion, and mounting frustration among civilians. Videos captured scenes of men being drafted despite clear evidence of physical disabilities, making the mobilization appear reckless and indifferent to basic fairness. These moments created profound anger because they reinforced the idea that the government was operating carelessly, treating human lives as expendable resources. Across the country, families reacted with intense emotion. Mothers confronted officers outside draft centers, demanding explanations for why their sons were being targeted. Fathers pleaded with authorities to reconsider. Sisters stood in crowds chanting for justice. These scenes echoed earlier chapters of Russian history, particularly the late Soviet era, when conscription into the war in Afghanistan sparked widespread resistance from families who refused to send their children into a conflict they did not support. The mobilization revived that same sense of personal violation, turning the issue into something that reached directly into the homes of millions of ordinary people. Meanwhile, Russia's borders transformed into dramatic choke points. Highways leading to Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia turned into rivers of cars stretching for kilometers. Drone footage posted online showed endless lines of vehicles, many filled with young men desperate to escape draft orders. Families inside cars rationed food and water. Others abandoned vehicles entirely and walked through fields in an attempt to find alternate routes. The desperation was unmistakable. One of the most striking developments was how rapidly these scenes circulated across Russian internet platforms despite the state's attempts to restrict information. People filmed their journeys, shared updates, and warned others about checkpoints and risks. The more the government tried to block these visuals, the farther they spread, confirming for many citizens that the situation was worse than official statements admitted. Russia's neighboring countries struggled to manage the influx. Georgia recorded its largest increase in border crossings since 2022. Small villages near the border found themselves overwhelmed by sudden waves of arrivals. Local officials expressed sympathy for those fleeing, but also warned that infrastructure was not built to handle such numbers. In Kazakhstan and Armenia, stories emerged of entire apartment complexes being rented out within hours. Restaurants and cafes filled with new arrivals, many of whom carried nothing but a backpack and whatever cash they had saved. These scenes reflected a growing sense of panic among Russian men who understood that once the mobilization machinery fully activated, their chances of escape would shrink dramatically. Inside Russia, this exodus had a powerful psychological impact. People watching these events unfold realized that the country was undergoing a moment of profound disturbance. Even those who did not personally know someone fleeing could see the collective fear reflected in the long lines at the borders. For some, the sight of so many young men leaving was heartbreaking. For others, it confirmed that the mobilization was fundamentally unjust. The government tried to reassure the public by insisting that only a limited number of individuals would be drafted, but those statements carried little credibility after the surprise announcement that broke earlier promises. On the political front, the reaction from elite figures became even more intriguing. Several regional lawmakers posted messages criticizing the mobilization, calling it rash and potentially destabilizing. Some argued that the government was placing their regions under impossible strain. Others insisted that drafting certain groups would devastate local industries already facing labor shortages. Although many of these posts were deleted within hours, screenshots spread widely, demonstrating that internal dissent was present at levels rarely seen. Even some military analysts on state television expressed cautious concern about the mobilization's effectiveness, raising questions about training capacity, equipment shortages, and the readiness of conscripts. These were not ordinary critics. They were voices that typically maintained a unified narrative, but now appeared shaken by the scale of unrest and the lack of preparedness. What made the internal reaction particularly dangerous for the Kremlin was that different regions experienced the mobilization with different intensities. Some ethnic minority areas, especially in the North Caucasus and Siberia, reported disproportionately high draft numbers. This pattern mirrored earlier criticisms from 2022, when regions with fewer political connections were targeted more heavily. In places like Dagestan, protests erupted with unusual force. Videos showed women blocking highways, shouting at police, and demanding an end to the mobilization. Men in several villages refused to appear at draft centers. Local officials found themselves unable to enforce the decree without triggering violent clashes. These regions had long histories of grievances related to inequality, discrimination, and economic marginalization. The mobilization reignited those tensions, creating conditions that could evolve into deeper political unrest. By the end of the second day, the situation reached a point where the government could no longer rely solely on traditional repression tactics. The scale of the protests meant that arresting individuals did not eliminate the momentum. For every person detained, others stepped forward to take their place. The protests were fueled not by a small group of organizers, but by widespread emotional outrage. This made them harder to predict and nearly impossible to suppress through targeted crackdowns. Several analysts noted that the Kremlin faced a dilemma. Escalating force risked creating martyrs and amplifying public anger, while restraint risked allowing the protests to grow further. The economic consequences also became clearer. Businesses across major cities reported sudden worker shortages as employees fled or went into hiding to avoid being drafted. Construction projects halted. Tech companies saw entire teams disappear overnight. Even small businesses like cafes and retail shops struggled to operate normally. These disruptions damaged consumer confidence and triggered fears of long-term economic instability. Russia's economy, already heavily impacted by sanctions, could not afford another shock of this magnitude. Internationally, the world watched with both fascination and caution. Governments across Europe and Asia monitored developments closely, trying to understand whether the unrest would remain limited or evolve into something larger. Analysts debated whether this could mark a turning point in Russia's political trajectory. While most agreed that predicting regime change was too early, they also acknowledged that Putin's image of total control had been weakened. The mobilization exposed vulnerabilities that had been hidden beneath years of managed stability. Western media dedicated extensive coverage to the protests, the border exodus, and the internal reaction from Russian elites. The global attention created additional pressure for the Kremlin, which had long tried to project narrative dominance by controlling information at home. As protests spread, Russian security forces expanded their response. Armored vehicles appeared in several cities. National Guard units were deployed to major intersections and railway stations. New checkpoints were established on roads leading out of certain regions. The Ministry of Internal Affairs issued stern warnings against further demonstrations, claiming that protests risked national security. But these measures did not produce the intended effect. Instead, they created a sense that the government was preparing for large-scale unrest, which further fueled public anxiety. Some cities experienced nighttime standoffs between protesters and police. In Moscow, groups gathered near the city center, chanting slogans calling for accountability and demanding the cancellation of the mobilization. Police attempted to disperse crowds using force, But the confrontations only strengthened the resolve of many participants. The chants grew louder. In St. Petersburg, students occupied university courtyards, forming circles where they shared information, made speeches, and discussed strategies for maintaining pressure on authorities. These scenes felt reminiscent of protest movements in other countries, but seeing them happen inside Russia in such numbers marked a dramatic shift in the country's political atmosphere. As the second day came to a close, the mood across Russia felt different. The fear that once kept people silent was still present, but it no longer dominated. For many, the anger that drove them into the streets became stronger than the fear of punishment. People realized that their futures, the futures of their families, and the stability of their communities were at stake. The mobilization was no longer just a policy disagreement. It was a moment of moral confrontation between the public and the state. Inside the Kremlin, reports indicate that discussions turned increasingly tense. Officials debated potential adjustments to the mobilization, including exemptions for certain groups, but any concession risked appearing weak. Delaying or limiting the mobilization could signal that public pressure works, potentially encouraging further dissent. Maintaining strict enforcement risked escalating the unrest beyond control. This internal deadlock highlighted the complexity of governing a nation that had reached a boiling point. The Kremlin had spent years building a system where political pressure rarely flowed upward, but the nationwide reaction forced even the highest levels of power to confront a reality they had tried to ignore. What became clear by the end of the 72 hours was that Russia was entering a new phase in its political evolution. Whether the protests would grow or eventually be contained remained unclear, but the psychological shift was undeniable. A population long considered passive had risen in defiance. A government that seemed unshakable found itself scrambling to maintain authority. The future of Russia would depend on how both sides responded in the days ahead. As the hours passed and Russia's political temperature continued rising, the world began asking a question many analysts had avoided for years. What happens if the stability Russians were told to depend on is nothing more than a thin layer of ice? And this sudden uprising is the crack that finally exposes the depth of discontent underneath? For more than 2 decades, Putin built his image around the idea that Russia was unshakable under his rule. But in reality, the country had been quietly accumulating pressure, resentment, and exhaustion. This unrest did not appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a system that demanded silence while stripping away choices, freedoms, and opportunities. The announcement that sparked this crisis simply pushed people past their breaking point. And now, for the first time, millions were openly questioning whether the old narrative still held any truth. What made this moment even more historic was how fast the uprising spread across demographics. It was no longer just young activists or political opposition groups raising their voices. This time, it was parents terrified of losing their sons. It was factory workers, teachers, and retired military officers who had lived through previous eras and recognized the familiar signs of a nation heading toward a dangerous crossroads. Even some of the people who had never participated in protests, who had once been the silent backbone of stability, were suddenly out in the streets, refusing to be invisible. The scale of the movement forced the world to pay attention, because when a country as large and influential as Russia experiences this level of internal disruption, it is never a purely domestic issue. The consequences ripple across global markets, security alliances, and energy systems. Whether people live in Europe, Africa, Asia, or the Americas, instability in Russia affects food prices, energy supply, diplomatic relations, and international security in ways that are felt far beyond its borders. Inside Russia, the government struggled to regain control of the narrative. State television tried to minimize the scale of the unrest, but social media footage exposed everything in real time. Streets overflowing with demonstrators. Police officers overwhelmed. Border checkpoints clogged with cars stretching for kilometers. Regional officials contradicting the Kremlin's messaging. It became impossible to hide the truth. And once a population sees that the fear barrier has been broken, the government can no longer rely on the old tools of silence and intimidation. That shift alone transformed the crisis into something far more threatening for the authorities than any single protest could have been. This uprising wasn't just an event. It was a psychological turning point for millions of people who had spent years believing that nothing could ever change. As tensions rose, Russia's leadership faced a dilemma with no perfect solution. A harsh crackdown risked igniting even more resistance. A concession would expose the limits of their control. Doing nothing would allow the unrest to spread. And so the entire world watched to see which path the government would choose, knowing that whichever decision came next would shape not just Russia's future, but the global political landscape for years to come. This was a moment that challenged assumptions, disrupted long-standing geopolitical expectations, and forced analysts to confront a possibility that once felt unimaginable. The idea that a system thought to be untouchable might be far more fragile than it appeared. In the end, what matters most is the lesson this moment leaves behind. When societies are pushed too far, when leaders stop listening, and when systems are built on the belief that people will stay silent forever, history has shown repeatedly that pressure does not disappear. It builds, it simmers, and eventually, it explodes in ways no one can fully control. This uprising was a reminder that the human desire for voice, agency, and dignity is more powerful than any political machine. And as Russia enters its next chapter, uncertain, unstable, and unpredictable, the world will be watching closely, knowing the stakes extend far beyond one nation's borders. What happens in Russia will influence global diplomacy, economic stability, and international security in ways we are only beginning to understand. That is why staying informed, paying attention, and engaging with events like this matters more than ever. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss our deep dives into the world's most important geopolitical events. What Russia experienced in those 72 hours wasn't just public anger. It was a rare moment when fear stopped working and a tightly controlled society revealed its breaking point. The mobilization decree didn't simply call men to war. It exposed deep fractures inside the government, the security forces, and the public itself. Families, students, workers, and even once loyal voices showed what happens when a nation finally confronts a promise the state can't keep. If you found this breakdown insightful and you want more deep dives into critical events shaping our world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.